This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended to provide teachers of 5th grade social studies with content knowledge to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. In this screencast, we will look at how events such as the arrest of Rosa Parks and the subsequent Montgomery bus boycotts, as well as the Brown versus the Board of Education lawsuit successfully argued by Thurgood Marshall, raised our nation's awareness of the inequities resulting from the long-held practices of Jim Crow laws in the South and elsewhere. We will see how peaceful protests and marches, such as the March on Washington, led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., resulted in changes to our laws and Constitution in the form of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act under President Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, and how Cesar Chavez also used peaceful protests to better the lives of farm workers in America. The long-needed changes brought about by these tumultuous times were not without their costs, and so we must examine the assassinations of 3 great men and the resultant impact this had on our society. The end of the Civil War and Reconstruction resulted in a series of actions and reactions that culminated with Congress declaring slavery to be illegal and establishing the right to vote for African American or black males, but still not only allowed for, but actually in some states required the practice of segregation through a series of laws collectively termed Jim Crow, after the derogatory song and dance routine performed by Thomas Dartmouth Daddy Rice. The justification for Jim Crow laws was that the Constitution guaranteed equality, and Jim Crow laws simply meant that the races would still be equal, just separated or segregated. In 1950, nearly a century after its establishment, Jim Crow was still very much in practice in the South, and as with the abolitionist movement and the Civil War, it took a series of events to raise people's awareness to the reality that separate was not equal, and that inequality was, in truth, an inherent part of Jim Crow. In fact, studies during that time showed that even if materially all things were held equal, which they generally were not, the mere act of segregating had a negative impact on the self-esteem of African American or black children. Our standard asks us to examine just 3 of the major civil rights protest movements, but we must be careful not to leave children with the impression that these were the only ones, or that Martin Luther King, Jr. was the only leader of the civil rights movement. The helpful resources links at the end of this screencast will offer some additional events and people to consider bringing into your classroom to more fully enrich our students' learning of this time period. That being said, let's turn our attention to one of the most galvanizing moments in the fight for true equality for African Americans or blacks, the arrest of Rosa Parks. By the time they reach the 5th grade, most of our students are familiar with the story of Rosa Parks, the tired seamstress who was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. But it is unlikely that they view it as the tiny spark fanned to flame by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. and Ralph David Abernathy in the form of the Montgomery bus boycotts that would abolish the long-held legal injustices of Jim Crow. On December 5, 1955, just 4 days after Rosa Parks' arrest, the boycott began, during which nearly all of the African American or black population of Montgomery refused to ride the bus, no matter how bad the weather. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. and other African American or black city leaders organized meetings and protest walks, bringing further national and even international attention to the situation in the South. The protesters adhered tenaciously to the maxims of civil disobedience and nonviolence. However, the opposition clearly held no such principles. The homes of both King and Abernathy were firebombed, despite the fact that King's wife and infant daughter were in the King home at the time. 4 churches that were used as meeting places for the civil rights leaders were also bombed, resulting in the deaths of 4 young girls at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The increasing financial pressure brought about by the very effective boycott, in combination with growing national support, along with the Supreme Court decision that the bus system could not discriminate based on race, brought about the end of the boycott and the desegregation of the bus system. While the fight for desegregation of the transit system was going on in Montgomery, the fight for desegregation of America's schools was finally drawing to a resolution across the nation with the implementation of the Supreme Court's 1954 decision in Brown versus the Board of Education that separate educational facilities were indeed inherently unequal. Brown versus the Board of Education was not actually one single court case, but rather the name given to 5 separate court cases regarding segregation of public schools that were consolidated into one to be considered by the Supreme Court. The landmark case, argued by Thurgood Marshall in his role as legal counsel for the NAACP, ended segregation of children based on race in all public schools in this nation. Thurgood Marshall would later make history again by becoming the first African American or black Supreme Court justice. Despite these 2 judicial victories, discriminatory practices were still rampant. Many African American or black citizens were prevented from voting through practices such as poll taxes, which charged a fee for voting, preventing poor people in general from voting, to literacy tests that only people who had slavery in their ancestry had to take. Some states even went so far as to make white-only polling places. Where these tactics didn't work, intimidation was used to simply scare African Americans or blacks away from the polling places. As protests against such practices grew, and as people across the nation reacted to the horrifying coverage of the brutal Southern police response to the peaceful protesters, President Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act, which banned discrimination and segregation in any public place in this country. To raise awareness of the act, and to apply pressure on Congress to pass it, the many leaders of the civil rights movement, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., organized a peaceful march on Washington, D.C. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, as it was officially called, was hugely successful, with more than 200,000 people from many races and faiths gathering on the lawn of the Lincoln Memorial to hear speeches and songs, culminating in the final powerful "I Have a Dream" speech by King himself. Tragically, before the bill could pass through Congress, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, but his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, took up the fight, and finally, on July 2, 1964, he was able to sign it into law. While the Civil Rights Act made discrimination and segregation illegal, it did nothing to address the many devious tactics being used in the South to deny African Americans or blacks their right to vote. It took the nationally televised video of police brutally beating participants in a peaceful voting rights march in Selma, Alabama, to prompt Congress, at President Johnson's urging, to recognize the need for a law to specifically outlaw such practices. The Voting Rights Act eliminated the use of literacy tests and gave the federal government the authority to oversee most aspects of voting, including voter registration, in areas where less than 50% of the African American or black population was registered to vote. Another activist who believed in peaceful protests and the use of boycotts to bring about societal change was Cesar Chavez. Chavez was born in Arizona, but he and his family moved to California, where they worked as migrant farm workers after they lost their own farm in the Great Depression. The low pay, poor conditions, and discrimination he experienced there soon led Chavez to found the National Farm Workers Association, a union that fought for the rights of migrant farm workers. When Filipino grape pickers in California decided to go on strike, they asked Chavez and his predominantly Latino group to join them in solidarity. Chavez, having closely followed and admired Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach to protest, agreed on the condition that all protests would be nonviolent. Chavez knew that if they were to make any headway, they would need to make their cause known beyond the California Valley, and so he organized marches that gained the group the national spotlight. As people became aware of the plight of the farm workers, they agreed to boycott purchasing table grapes or wine made from those grapes. It took 5 years and a great deal of dedication, but the boycott and strike were finally effective, and the grape growers and farm workers signed contracts that improved the pay and benefits for the workers. The 50s, 60s, and early 70s were a time of great societal change in our country, and while for many these changes were welcomed and considered well overdue, others feared these changes and reacted violently against them. In just a few short years, 3 great men and leaders would be taken from us by an assassin's bullet. The first loss to stun our nation took place on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, when Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President John F. Kennedy as he rode in the presidential motorcade. More questions than answers surround this particular tragic event, as Oswald was, in turn, assassinated by Jack Ruby, before any information, including his motive for killing the president, could be determined. Less than 5 years later, on April 4th, 1968, a bullet would once again take away a great leader, one who held strong to his nonviolent principles, and yet his life would end with a single violent act. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot as he stood on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. James Earl Ray, noted for his racist leanings, was arrested and pled guilty to the murder, but later recanted his admission. Just 2 months after King's murder, Senator Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's younger brother, was shot after winning the California primary in his bid to run for President of the United States. The Palestinian-born Sirhan Sirhan was arrested on the scene and confessed to the crime. The 3 assassinations in so short a period of time rocked our nation's confidence and sense of security. It made us feel vulnerable to know that with a single violent act, the course of our nation could be changed, that so much that people had been fighting for could be taken away in an instant. Many have speculated as to what would have been had any of these men not been taken from us, much less all 3. At the very least, we lost a little of our innocence, a little bit of our naivete. That is all we have time for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here are the links to some helpful resources, as well as those used in the making of this screencast.